This is where the U.S. government's plans sort of shrink through the Cold War, is they start out with these big national operation alerts, really trying to save large chunks of the American population. And then as time and space become more constrained, the strength of the weapons increases, they realize that the American public is largely unsavable and that they are going to shrink their ambitions down to just the core of the US government.
Welcome to My Nuclear Life. I'm Shelley Lesher. Somehow I found the book Raven Rock, the story of the US government's secret plan to save itself while the rest of us die by Garrett Graff. And I had to read it. I mean, it's got to be one of the best titles for a book I've ever heard. And let me tell you, it did not disappoint. And like everything else nuclear that I find interesting or exciting, I had to share it with you. So today I am joined by the author of that book, Garrett Graff. Garrett is quite an accomplished journalist and author with multiple books about governmental history. There is, of course, the Raven Rock book, and another one, The Only Plane in the Sky, that grew out of the Raven Rock book, which we will briefly discuss. His most recent book is on the Watergate scandal. So let's set it up. Your book goes into great detail about the evolution of the presidents and who does what when, but kind of the last iteration, I guess I should say the best one, best meaning the way that the government will survive. What would that look like to the White House or the president?
Part of the weirdness of the US government's doomsday plans is the expectation through most of the Cold War is that the president, whoever that is, he or she, dies in the opening salvo of the war. And there are some reasons to expect that. Basically, part of the challenge of being moved to a safe relocation facility is that you would be out of communication for some period of time. And so the sort of expectation is that the president, in essence, dies at his desk because he is trying to command U.S. forces right up until the moment of the attack. And so while there is a lot of effort that would go into trying to save the president if it was possible, the idea is, and this is a big part of the really sort of psychological transformation of the presidency during the Cold War, is the way that it expands from a single person into an office. The president is dead, long live the president. That there is always someone somewhere who is able to step into the presidency. That may not be anyone that you have ever heard of before. It may be someone well down the cabinet line of succession who steps in to be acting president, but that what you would end up seeing is that the presidency in the event of a nuclear war would really end up with like an A team, a B team, and a C team. And that everyone would scatter for hardened relocation facilities, mobile command centers led by tractor trailer trucks, mountain bunkers, what was known during the Cold War as NECAP, now known as NIOC, which is the National Airborne Operations Center, the president's doomsday plane, and that you would sort of have the president as the A team. You would have the B team of the vice president heading somewhere else, the House Speaker, the president pro tem of the Senate. You would have the C team of sort of all of the cabinet secretaries, Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, Secretary of the Treasury, on down to the last person in the line of succession today, the Secretary of Homeland Security. And that sort of the hope would be when all of the dust settles, one of those people is still alive somewhere and is able to step in as the acting president.
Did they ever try to do this? Did they ever do a test of, are they going to be able to get these people in their 5 directions all safe and sound?
This is part of what makes the Cold War so fascinating is that, you know, the U.S. spent an incredible amount of time, money and effort and thinking trying to plan for nuclear war and practicing for nuclear war to an extent that is almost unimaginable to us today. Through the 1950s, there would be these national operation alerts where the entire country would practice nuclear war on a given day, often in June. In New York City, the stock market would shut down. All of the buses in New York City would pull over and people would run into fallout shelters.
That's
schools
crazy.
Across the country would close and run into fallout shelters. The president and the cabinet and the defense leaders would retreat to mountain camps and mountain bunkers to practice nuclear war for literally days at a time. The president would leave Washington for several days to go practice. Dwight Eisenhower would go off into the Virginia and Pennsylvania mountains for several days at a time to practice nuclear war in a very public way. And then as time progresses and as nuclear technology progresses, sort of the US government's hopes and dreams shrink. And that you have this moment in the 1950s when nuclear war, in a way that again seems unimaginable to us, sort of seems thinkable. You are talking about scores or hundreds of atomic bombs. You're talking about bombers, not missiles. You're talking about 8, 10, 12 hours worth of warning. There's an idea that, the US might get hit by 80 A-bombs, but most of America would still be untouched after that, and you'd have to chart a path forward for the country. And then you go from atomic bombs to thermonuclear bombs. You go from bombers to missiles. You go from hours of warning to minutes of warning. The reality, of course, today is that Washington would be destroyed with, give or take, 6 or 7 minutes worth of warning now by a submarine-launched ballistic missile off the Atlantic coast.
So, the president isn't even going to be able to get out of bed.
Exactly. And so then it becomes this system where you need people hiding away from Washington. You need to keep these bunkers staffed 24 hours a day, 365, because Washington might be gone and the only people who are left are whatever sort of 1-star, 2-star general happens to be in the Raven Rock bunker in Waynesboro, Pennsylvania on that particular day.
And there are apocalyptic movies or TV shows in which those are the scenarios.
Yes, and they are in fact all quite based in reality. Part of what I found so fascinating about my book research was that no matter how farcical or satirical or cynical the sort of satire of the Cold War or sci-fi of the Cold War was, that the reality was in fact much weirder. In Dr. Strangelove, there are all of the scenes of them beating their chests over America's mine shaft gap. Well, what you actually learn is that in the 1950s, America did worry about a mine shaft gap. And that they sent Boy Scouts out across the country to map America's caves and mine shafts and to figure out how many of Americans could be saved in the existing network of America's mine shafts and underground caves.
Oh my gosh. That actually, there's a question at the very end that I wanted to ask you, which is, what movie do you think is more realistic, since we're talking about movies? Threads, the British end of the world movie, or The Day After?
It's a good question. Day After just rocked the country when it came out. And I think, again, in a way that is sort of hard to... So I was born in 1981. Day After was in the early 1980s. I don't remember it as a kid. I don't remember it as a moment. And so even for me, it's hard to go back and try to understand what a big deal it was. But it was a really big deal and probably actually altered the trajectory of the Cold War in a meaningful way, in the way that it sort of pushed Ronald Reagan, a president uniquely attuned to the power of movies, to realize and reckon with how awful a nuclear war would actually be.
But without that kind of cultural context, just watching the movie, what's depicted in the movie, do you think it's more realistic than Threads or the way that nuclear war would play out or a bombing would play out?
I think the challenge is nuclear war is so unthinkable that it's really hard to figure out what the realistic scenario is. And I think that barrier of nuclear war being so unthinkable is part of what makes the planning for it through the Cold War and even the modern age so strange. Is you see people really trying to break down this thing that is unimaginable in its horror and complexity into something that is sort of processable by a bureaucracy in the same way that like a normal budgeting cycle can account for. One of my sort of favorite examples in all of this is the extent to which the IRS in the Cold War did all of this really advanced planning for how it would levy taxes on nuclear damaged property, basically institute a nationwide VAT tax, sort of European style VAT tax, because you couldn't really assess property taxes after nuclear war, because if your building got destroyed, was it worth what it was worth before the war or after it was destroyed?
I mean, some of that is so crazy. If I can't even eat, why am I going to care about the IRS?
Yes.
There's nowhere in my life in which the IRS is going to come before any of that, right? Like just survival.
There are only two constants in life, death and taxes. And
That's
so
true.
If in nuclear war, the first doesn't get you, the second still is.
Oh, man.
Yeah. My favorite sort of piece of trivia from the UK side of the nuclear war planning is this thing that actually still occurs today that is called the letters of last resort, which is the US government basically assumes in its war planning that someone will still be in charge of the US military on the other side of nuclear war. That basically there will still be someone who is able to reach whatever remains of the nation's missile silos, bombers, and nuclear submarines. And there are all sorts of layers of redundancy of communication channels and planes and radio systems. The UK actually the UK is a small island at the end of the day. And they assumed it was actually quite possible that the entire country would be destroyed in the opening minutes of a nuclear war. The UK has a series of nuclear missile submarines. And so the first thing that a UK prime minister does when he or she takes office is sits down and writes what are known as the handwritten letters of last resort. And they are the instructions for the missile sub-commanders in the event that all of the UK is lost. And the letters are signed and then sealed inside a safe of each of the missile submarines. So there's an identical letter that goes into each of the submarines. And they are meant to be opened only in the event of the total loss of the UK. And we don't know what any one of them has ever said. We don't know what the instructions of any UK prime minister has ever been. But in sort of general terms, they are sort of thought to include, among them, the options of ordering a launch against whatever country attacked the UK, not ordering a launch and sort of figuring like, look, everyone is dead now. What's the point?
What does it matter? Yeah.
Or sort of 3, some set of specific instructions of sort of who to turn their sub-command over to. Do you go to Australia and try to find someone who survived in Australia? Do you turn yourself over to NATO? Do you turn yourself over to Canada or the US and sort of search for an alternate military command and sort of political decision maker who can instruct you in what to say. And whenever a prime minister leaves office, the previous letters are destroyed and replaced with the new ones. There's no archive of these. We will never read what they were at key moments during the Cold War. But it's sort of this, in some ways, I think like this much more poignant power than the US president's nuclear football, in the context of basically the first thing we ask of a UK prime minister is to think through what happens after the end of their entire country.
Yeah, that is way more powerful than just a split-second decision. What I want to ask is, what's really interesting about your book, and what I think a lot of my listeners don't realize and a lot of my students don't realize, is how much the Cold War and the government spending and all of these continuity of government planning has impacted what we see now. So what are some of the things that happen during this kind of planning for continuity of government that we may still see remnants of, or that we don't even consider was impacted by this huge plan?
A couple of different things I would sort of point out that most people don't really think about. The way that you and I are talking right now is the literal embodiment of our nuclear war planning.
What? Okay, how?
The internet grew out of the U.S. Defense Department's attempts to build a decentralized communication system that would survive nuclear war. I mean, there would be no internet without the attempts by the Pentagon to figure out how to survive nuclear war. Anytime you go on Expedia or Orbitz or however you make your airplane reservations, the system that underpins the entire American Airlines reservation system, which is known as Sabre, actually grew out of the first air defense radar systems to track incoming Soviet nuclear bombers.
Okay.
Literally, this is like the way that you make your airline reservations today is a system built upon how we first tried to track Soviet nuclear bombers coming over the poles. And then the literal first online chat program, the forerunner of Facebook Messenger, AOL Instant Messenger, SMS, like the texting that you are doing on your cell phone every day right now, is a direct outgrowth of the technology first developed for FEMA to communicate between its different doomsday bunkers, because it was looking for a quick, low-tech, and text-constrained way to communicate urgently in an emergency, because what FEMA was trying to avoid was encouraging people to write long letters in the event of an emergency. The forerunner of all SMS texting grew out of a FEMA bunker in Mount Weather, Virginia, in Berryville, Virginia.
They had to like T9 it.
Exactly. Yeah.
So you mentioned FEMA. FEMA then is not the FEMA now?
And vice versa, which is the forerunner of FEMA is the Federal Civil Defense Administration, the FCDA, which goes through like 19 different renamings and reshuffling between different cabinet departments and executive departments before it ends up as FEMA in the Carter administration. Now, obviously part of the Department of Homeland Security. But what most people don't realize is that sort of FEMA's point is that it is the agency that runs our nation's continuity programs, that it is the like government's doomsday planner, and that it only got into civilian emergency management because it had developed all of this expertise in civil defense and disaster response. But thankfully, during the Cold War, it turned out we didn't have a lot of nuclear wars, and we did have a lot more natural disasters. And so it sort of begins to morph in the 60s into something that is sort of more recognizable as the nation's civilian federal disaster agency. and then becomes this thing that we focus on, or that sort of day to day we think of as the people who show up after the tornadoes and hurricanes and forest fires and floods and natural disasters. Even though today, a huge chunk of FEMA's budget actually remains classified continuity of government and continuity of operations planning that the American public has no real knowledge of.
So we still plan for continuity of government.
Yes, still very much. And in fact, it's like more advanced in some ways now than it ever was. You can actually go online and track now the daily exercises and operations of the president's doomsday plane, which is sort of still floating around out there, ready to evacuate the president at a moment's notice. There is still a system. It's gone through sort of a couple of new renamings, but at the sort of core of the system is what's known as the Central Locator Service, which is a FEMA program, or was a FEMA program, to track the presidential successors minute by minute, every place that they were, every place that they are on a daily basis, to know, in the event of an attack on Washington, who is the highest ranking presidential successor who is still alive at any given moment.
I was going to say that's annoying, except we all are doing it on our phones. So
it's much of the same technology, actually. And these bunkers that we talk about, NORAD in Cheyenne Mountain in Colorado, Mount Weather in Berryville, Virginia, Raven Rock in Waynesboro, Pennsylvania, are still all staffed 24 hours a day, 365, and are this incredibly strange mix of like doomsday bunker and banal office workplace. If you get all the way into the center of NORAD in Cheyenne Mountain, a quarter mile into the granite tunnels and the office complex there, there is a Subway fast food franchise.
No.
That is the cafeteria inside NORAD. And so, like, if you work there on a day-to-day basis, like, there's a Subway sandwich artist making $5 footlongs as your office lunch, sort of leads to this, like, very weird...
that is so weird.
Sort of, like, Christopher Guest movie-esque script of, like, the Subway sandwich artist who survives nuclear war and is, like, still there making sandwiches, as the world ends.
Do you have a card into one of these bunkers so that you can be an end-of-the-world historian?
I am not. I have been inside the NORAD bunker, so, like, I've been to that Subway.
Do you get a card? Do you get, like, a special punch on your footlong card?
I've not been into, unfortunately, either of the other facilities, although I would absolutely love to see one of them someday.
I'll be your plus one.
Well, thanks. But, again, these are, super weird places that are, half doomsday bunker and part office. Like, inside Raven Rock, there's a badminton court.
Okay, that doesn't surprise me, though, especially if it's in the 50s and there's a bunch of guys and they're like, oh, we should have squash and we should have badminton. What else are we going to do for our lives here that we have to spend 6 months of our lives here and then we go home? Like, yeah, I can see that. One of the things, as far as when I was reading about some of the different things that happened when the government was looking at how to save the population, is that they started spreading the population out after the war. Was that done on purpose? The story's always been told that soldiers came home and they needed to build homes, so they put them out further from the center of the city. But was there something more going on there?
Yes and no. This is a part of the intersection that you see of sort of American society, Cold War planning, where you see it's not dual use in the way that we sort of in nuclear technology often think of like dual use technologies as civilian and nuclear, civilian and military, but sort of dual use Cold War planning materials where Dwight Eisenhower builds the National Interstate Highway System in part because it's sort of good for America. He's obsessed with logistics as a general and is obsessed with transportation infrastructure and was part of this really crazy road trip across the country in the 1920s as a young soldier that did not go very well. Like, they barely made it across the country.
I can relate.
Then he goes to Germany and sees the Autobahn and sort of how militarily useful good roads are. The actual Interstate Highway Act is known formally as the National Interstate and Defense Highway Act. And it was built very explicitly to speed war material around the country in the event of nuclear war. And that a big part of the sort of ring highways that you see around so many cities, including the Beltway in DC, grow out of sort of the thinking that we need good ring roads around major cities in order to help evacuate them quickly and move war material around before and during and after a nuclear attack.
So a ring road is supposed to help evacuate quickly?
The sort of feeder roads out to the ring roads out to the bigger roads.
Because it doesn't seem to work in DC at rush hour.
No, it does not. It does not.
It wasn't planned for the population.
Yeah.
That perhaps has grown out.
Like, it's worth talking about as we sort of go through the sort of racial reckoning right now about the structural racism of certain government programs, basically how racist so much of the Cold War planning turns out to be in hindsight, which is the whole national fallout shelter movement is basically geared towards like white suburban families, and that it sort of presupposes that like you have a home where you can have a basement, and that's not true of urban areas, and that's not true of much of the South where homes don't have basements, and that there's sort of this 1950s ideal of the sort of white suburban family with a 2-car garage and 1.5 bathrooms and 1.5 children that you see reflected in so much of the US government's Cold War planning.
Well, you see that in all of the nuclear tests as well.
Yes, absolutely.
And I didn't even think about that because I grew up in the Midwest. We always had a basement. Mm-hmm. But of course, in the South, you wouldn't have basements. California, most of them don't have basements. And then, of course, when they're telling people to dig fallout shelters, a lot of people in cities don't have backyards.
Right.
When you said that FEMA originally started as the U.S. Civil Defense Agency, that implies that they're concerned about us as civilians. Did they take on any of these issues about populations having access to fallout shelters, say in the cities?
This is where the U.S. government's plans sort of shrink through the Cold War, is they start out with these big national operation alerts, really trying to save large chunks of the American population. And then as time and space become more constrained, the strength of the weapons increases, they realize that the American public is largely unsavable, and that they are going to shrink their ambitions down to just the core of the U.S. government.
But who are they going to govern?
The answer is not very many people, but still some. This begins to sound sort of crazy as you talk about it, but under the worst case scenarios of nuclear war, there are still about 60 million people who survive in the United States. You know, we would lose 80 to 90% of the American population in an all-out global thermonuclear war. But in a big country like we have, you still end up with 60 million people. And so you sort of still end up with something that is like roughly the size of France today. That's not nothing. And that government is really designed to preserve that government for whoever actually ends up surviving.
Did you ever calculate how much money was spent over the years on this?
So the answer is hundreds of billions, but it becomes really hard to calculate because we spend trillions of dollars on the nuclear infrastructure, the missiles, the bombers, the submarines. We spend hundreds of millions of dollars a year on the president's communication system. All of these things are things that are useful on a day-to-day basis and then also happen to be useful during a nuclear war. drawing the line specifically around what's a nuclear war investment and what's a day-to-day investment, it is hard. But I think that sort of one of the things that most people don't think about is all of the toys that we think about that surround the majesty of the modern imperial presidency. The limousines, the helicopters, Air Force One are basically tools to keep the president in charge of the nation's nuclear arsenal wherever he happens to be. And that 100% of that is really an investment of the Cold War in the communications infrastructure necessary to keep the president of the United States in touch with what's known as the National Military Command Center at the Pentagon, minute by minute, hour by hour, wherever he is in the entire world. At a very basic level, the story that I trace in Raven Rock is the story of how time and space constrain and reshape the American presidency, because the presidency that we think of in the pre-nuclear age, I mean, until August 1945, is a much slower paced thing. President FDR, when he goes to the dedication of the Hoover Dam, his motorcade gets lost in the canyons on the drive back to Las Vegas. He disappears for hours and no one knows where he is. No one knows how to get in contact with him. No one knows where he might appear. As late as when Harry Truman takes over as vice president, the vice president didn't have Secret Service protection. The vice president, would sort of wander around Washington on his own day to day, because no one could imagine needing a vice president urgently. Sort of as long as you could sort of find the vice president in the course of, a morning, an afternoon, maybe a couple of hours notice, that's the best you could need for the presidency. And of course, in a very short order, that begins to change and unfold in a much more dramatic way going forward.
There's one time in which the continuity of government plans actually have to be enacted. When was that and how did it work out?
These plans were effectively only ever activated on 9/11 itself, and they didn't work, is the sort of shortest possible answer. They didn't work for all of the reasons that people had long predicted that they wouldn't. They didn't work in very human ways, where the Pentagon was hit on 9/11, and Donald Rumsfeld, the Secretary of Defense, didn't want to evacuate the Pentagon. I have a whole separate book actually on 9/11 that grew out of my research on Raven Rock that's called The Only Plane in the Sky, that sort of traces all of this in much greater human detail.
I'll have to read that, because this little line of story was fascinating in Raven Rock. That, just such respect for Donald Rumsfeld. He just would not leave. All the planning you can do, and then there's people just saying, too bad, I'm not going anywhere.
He not only doesn't leave, he does the exact wrong thing, which is he goes to the crash site and helps evacuate the wounded from the crash site. And it's this incredibly wonderful human moment that sort of permanently endears him to the US military and the personnel of the Pentagon. But if you are the Secretary of Defense, the exact wrong thing to do instinctually in a moment of crisis like that, when you should be placed aboard a helicopter and rushed off to Raven Rock, and that it's actually only sort of several hours later that he deigns to send his deputy, Paul Wolfowitz, off to Raven Rock for the day to sort of ensure that continuity of government and continuity of operations. He makes a series of incredible leadership decisions that day that are exactly the wrong things that you were supposed to do.
According to the written plan.
According to the written plan, yes.
And then the only plane in the sky is who at that time?
So the only plane in the sky is President Bush, who sort of sees the plans, the continuity of government plans sort of fall apart in his own, very predictable way, which is President Bush, of course, that morning on 9/11 is at Emma Booker Elementary School in Sarasota, Florida. And he is reading to school kids that morning, as we sort of all famously remember, and is whisked aboard Air Force One within minutes of that attack that morning. And Air Force One does what the continuity of government plans call for, which is hide the president away in the sky and keep him airborne away from any potential trouble for the entire day. And he leapfrogs first to Barksdale Air Force Base in Shreveport, Louisiana, then flies on eventually to Offutt Air Force Base outside Omaha, Nebraska, and then eventually returns to Washington at the end of the day. And he does exactly the right thing for the continuity of government plans. And it ends up in this big tussle between him and the Secret Service and the military that day, because he is desperate to return to Washington. He understands the sort of moral human leadership aspect necessary of being the president in charge in Washington, and understands at the same time that he is sort of this dual role as head of state on the one hand and commander-in-chief in the other, and he's doing the right thing as commander-in-chief, and it's the wrong thing as head of state. And that day's leadership vacuum is, of course, filled by Rudy Giuliani. Who, marches right down to the crash zone in Lower Manhattan to, what we now call Ground Zero. Rudy Giuliani makes a whole series of terrible decisions himself leading up to 9/11, including placing the New York's Emergency Operations Center inside the World Trade Center, this high-profile terror target. And so his emergency command center is destroyed in the opening minutes of that attack, and he is sort of left to wander around the streets by himself. But he sort of seems like this great leader that day as the news anchors savage President Bush for remaining out of sight and out of touch that day, even though President Bush is doing exactly the right thing for the nation's emergency plans.
I had no idea. It made sense once I read your book and I had a little bit of understanding for what happened. But at the time, no one thought of that. It was just, right. Where is he? What's going on? Why isn't he here? And then, of course, he can't get any information. So he's up in the sky, left in the dark. And that's nowhere that you want to be, yeah.
He's out of touch for most of the key moments of 9/11. And Don Rumsfeld, actually, the head of our U.S. military as Secretary of Defense, is totally out of touch for the totality of the attacks on the United States and doesn't get back to the National Military Command Center at the Pentagon until after the last plane is already down on the ground.
What was the most surprising thing that you found while you were researching this book?
So I think, to me, the most surprising aspect of this is how thoroughly the U.S. government planned and how thoroughly it envisioned what a post-apocalyptic U.S. government would look like. Every corner of the U.S. government ended up getting assigned this set of post-nuclear apocalypse plans, up to and including these incredibly detailed plans about the National Park Service would run refugee camps inside national parks around the country, with the expectation that the national parks would be largely untouched by nuclear war, and so would be sort of a good place for the fleeing evacuees of urban areas to head to. We've talked about the IRS and their plans. The post office would be in charge of registering the nation's dead and figuring out who was still alive. The agriculture department would be in charge of feeding the country after nuclear war. And that sort of every aspect of the U.S. government had this weird sort of strange Lovian shadow mission in the wake of nuclear war.
Do you think at the time In the middle of the Cold War, do you think the average citizen would have been shocked that the U.S. had all these plans? Do you think it would have comforted them, or do you think they would have been a little surprised that they weren't included?
Again, it depends a little bit on what aspect of the Cold War we're talking about, because in the 50s and through the early 60s, there were pretty extensive plans for the average American. Later on, what would surprise people is less that they weren't included and more how many other people were supposed to be included. The idea that there were thousands of people who went to work on a day-to-day basis in these doomsday facilities around the country without any public notice. I mean, to me, one of the weirdest after effects of writing this book is the number of people who I have heard from who have read the book or heard me talking about it and had this sort of moment of realization where they're like, holy moly, I just realized my dad wasn't a boring AT&T communications tech for my entire childhood. He worked at a doomsday facility. And that there were so many of these people who had this pretend cover job that was super boring to their families and their neighbors, and sort of only they knew that they were actually working in a doomsday facility. There's actually an amazing, I'll give sort of a little bit of a spoiler / plug here. There's an amazing new book of essays by a Nashville writer named Mary Louise Philpott, book called Bomb Shelter. One of the essays is about her dad calling her when she was working in a library, presumably in 2017 when this book came out, and saying, can you pick up this book, Raven Rock? It reminds me of my time there. And the author of the essay being like, your time where? And him being like, my time working at Raven Rock. And she sort of has this moment of realization that when she was a young kid growing up outside DC, that her dad was working at a doomsday bunker and had never mentioned it to her before.
Thank you for listening to this episode, and thank you to Garrett for his time. If you want to learn more, please read his book on Raven Rock or 9/11, or I've posted some more content on the podcast Patreon page. For this or other information, please visit our website at mynuclearlife.com. If you would like to send us a comment or question, use mynuclearlife@protonmail.com. The best way to help others find us is to tell a friend or leave a rating or review on iTunes. Until next time, I'm Shelley Lesher, and this has been My Nuclear Life.